Welcome. In this first of two videos, I'm going to try to explain how metaphorical comparisons work and articulate exactly why, while potentially effective, they are nonetheless always inaccurate. The purpose here is to start seeing language itself as a kind of metaphorical activity, which will help to inform future discussions about the social, cultural, and political implications of language use. So now for more drawings. Actually, okay, before we get to the drawings, I would preface by clarifying that in this context I am using metaphor to describe any description of a thing in terms of something else. That may seem to contradict what many of us have learned about the differences between metaphors and similes, where metaphors literally describe something as something else, and similes simply say something is like something else. But for this discussion, we're talking about both situations. As of this recording, the Oxford English Dictionary's definition of metaphor makes no specific mention of that distinction, so I hope you'll bear with me. Distinguishing between metaphor and simile may be meaningful in other contexts, of course, just not right here and now. In fact, another way to frame this caveat is by saying that this discussion of metaphor pretty much applies to simile as well, for our purposes. Okay, so a metaphorical comparison is when we say that something is something else. Object A is object B, even though it isn't that thing. Already, maybe you can see the essential conundrum, but let's dig in. If you've seen some of my other videos, it probably won't surprise you that I'll start with a little bit of terminology so that we have a shared language for analyzing this kind of language manipulation. There are two components to a metaphorical comparison, tenor and vehicle. The tenor is the object that is lacking a description. That's the thing we're trying to describe by using a metaphor. Often, not always, but often, the tenor is something abstract. Remember the difference between abstract and concrete. Things that are abstract are not really easy to define in the first place because they refer to things that aren't tangible and don't usually have objective physical characteristics that we can rely on to communicate a precise meaning. Whereas concrete details provide some immediate sensation that a reader can readily identify with. Think anger, an abstract concept, versus she punched a hole in the wall, which is a pretty concrete description of an action that, in the right context, a reader might immediately interpret with precision. Again, the point is that the tenor of a metaphor is often an abstract thing, not so easily defined, which is why we have to resort to metaphor in the first place. So then, we are going to provide that tenor with a vehicle, which will communicate a description onto the tenor. Whatever physical characteristics the vehicle has may be applied to the tenor. Like a vehicle transfers someone or something from one place to another, a metaphor's vehicle transfers characteristics, and in the process, hopefully, if it's done right, evokes in the reader the meaning the author is looking to communicate. That's basically how metaphor functions. You have these two components, the tenor and the vehicle, and the characteristics of the vehicle are applied to the tenor. Here's a metaphor we can analyze. Love is a shining sun. How romantic. Cheesy, maybe, but it'll work to help us conduct a metaphorical analysis to determine just how effective the comparison might be. Remember, when you're analyzing a text, it's nice to have a process to fall back on if meaning doesn't just jump right out at you. You can also use this to help determine whether or not a comparison you're thinking about using might be as clear and effective as you want it to be. So here's the analytical process. Love is the thing in this comparison that is essentially lacking in description. It's an abstract concept. We could potentially all define love in different ways, and even use the word love more than once in a single sentence and in reality mean different kinds of things. Like, I love pizza. I love my new phone. But I also love my grandmother. It can be used in many different ways and can mean many different things. It's a complicated, abstract idea. What we're trying to do with the use of a metaphor here is communicate a particular kind of feeling, a particular sense of what the word love is used sometimes to describe. So love is the tenor, the thing that's lacking in description. The shining sun, then, is the vivid, physical, concrete thing that is going to be communicating a description. It's the vehicle. So let's do this. Let's look at some characteristics of the shining sun. There are just a few physical, sensory, even objective characteristics that come immediately to my mind when we're talking about the sun. It's hot, it's bright, it's big, it's out there in the sky somewhere, out in space. It's constantly exploding, which is crazy. One day it's going to expand as it ages and consume some of the solar system. This is by no means an exhaustive list, and one person's sense of that thing may differ in some ways from another person's, but in order to analyze this metaphor, we should think about these kinds of implications, because the characteristics of the vehicle may be transferred to the tenor. Again, depending on who's doing the interpreting. What I mean is that any of these things, and more, might be potentially applied to love, the tenor. So let's think about it. Well, hot, bright, big, sure, I guess. These are all characteristics that are, in their own way may acceptably apply to a feeling of romantic love. But I'm not so sure about in the sky. Constantly exploding? Yeah, okay, maybe. But you see where I'm going with this. Not all of the possible characteristics or perceived characteristics of the vehicle will necessarily match up with what the love we are describing is actually like. So this is not a terrible metaphor, and maybe in some context it would work, but it does kind of leave one wondering, what's the reader going to gather from the vehicle that the author didn't intend? This gets to the central point of this video. Metaphors are helpful and can be quite effective, but they are inaccurate. They can be very helpful in that application of characteristics of one thing to another in a given context, but whether as author or critical audience, it is in our best interest to consider just how squarely the comparison fits.